Okay, let's dive in. Today, we're tackling a really significant piece of legislation, something that, well, touches almost everyone on the road. The Road Accident Fund Act 56 of 1996. Now, this act, it's known for being complex, right? So our mission today is to really unpack it, get past just the legal jargon. We want to give you, our listeners, a clear, practical handle on what this law actually does, its structure, its aims, and, what it means in the real world when an accident happens.
And clarity is definitely needed. It's a very consolidated piece of law. Our sources show it's been regularly looked at, updated with the latest review noted as July 2025. It's basically the central system for handling compensation after road accidents.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. The Road Accident Fund, or RAF, why does it even exist? What's its main job?
The Act itself states it very clearly right up front in Section 3. Its sole purpose, the object of the fund, is paying compensation for loss or damage that's wrongfully caused by someone driving a motor vehicle. It's essentially the road's legal safety net.
A safety net. Okay. And what is the fund, legally speaking?
Good question. Section 2 defines it. The RAF is established as a juristic person. Now, for anyone not familiar with legal speak, that basically just means it's treated like a separate legal entity. Think of it like a company. It can own things, make contracts, and crucially, it can be sued.
And it wasn't just invented out of thin air, right? There was something before it.
Exactly. It built on what came before. Section 2, subsection 2, confirms the RAF took over everything: assets, debts, rights, duties from the old Multilateral Motor Vehicle Accidents Fund, the MMVAF. When this act started, the old MMVAF just, ceased to exist. It was meant to be a seamless handover for claimants.
That sounds like a massive undertaking. So beyond just paying out claims, what else does the RAF actually do? The governance must be pretty involved.
Oh, it is. Section 4 covers its general functions. Obviously, investigating and settling claims is key. But it also involves managing its finances, getting reinsurance, to cover potentially huge payouts. And interestingly, Section 4, too, even allows it to contribute money to road safety projects.
So a bit of prevention, too, not just cure.
Precisely. It has that dual role, and it's all overseen by a board, appointed according to the Act, and managed day to day by a chief executive officer, the CEO.
Right. Which brings us to the million rain question, maybe literally. Where does all the money come from to fund this?
It comes from us, the road users, but sort of indirectly. Section 5 is clear. The main funding source is the Road Accident Fund levy. This is a charge that's collected via the Customs and Excise Act.
So it's in the fuel price?
Essentially, yes. A portion of what you pay for petrol or diesel goes towards this levy. It's taken from the National Revenue Fund and paid over to the RAF. They can also raise loans if needed, but the levy is the primary income.
Okay, that makes sense. And I understand the structure isn't just one giant central office handling every single claim.
That's right. It would be impractical. Section 8 allows the board to appoint agents. These are often insurance companies or similar bodies, to handle certain types of claims, usually the more straightforward ones, where the drivers involved are known. But importantly, the RAF guarantees the obligations of these agents, so the claimant is still protected even if an agent handles their case.
Okay, got it. Let's shift gears then to the absolute core of the Act. This is what people really need to understand. Who gets compensation and for what kind of loss?
This is Section 17(1), the heart of the Act. The fund must compensate any person the law calls them the third party for loss or damage they suffer because of bodily injury or death that was caused by or arose from the driving of a motor vehicle.
Okay, caused by or arising from.
Yes, and crucially, the injury or death has to be due to the negligence or some other wrongful act of the driver or the vehicle's owner. That fault element is key. And this applies even if you don't know who the driver or owner was, although there are specific regulations you have to follow in those hit-and-run scenarios.
But there's a major but here, isn't there? Especially regarding certain types of claims.
A very significant one. Compensation for what's called non-pecuniary loss. That's the legal term for things like pain and suffering, loss of amenities of life, the sort of intangible impact is heavily restricted.
Restricted how?
You can only claim for this type of loss if your injury qualifies as a serious injury. That's a critical threshold. Section 17(1)(a) says the assessment of whether an injury is serious has to follow a specific method, which is set down in regulations after consulting with doctors and medical providers. It's not just up to the court anymore unless the injury meets that serious definition.
Okay, the serious injury threshold. And then there are the money limits, the caps. This is where it gets really practical for people trying to figure out what they might receive.
Absolutely, particularly for future losses. So if you're claiming for future loss of income because you can no longer work, or loss of support if a breadwinner has died. Section 17(4)(b) says this can be paid as a lump sum or in installments.
But there's a limit on how much loss is considered.
Yes, a very strict one. Section 17(4)(c), read with subsection 4a, sets an annual cap on the loss of income or support that the fund will calculate. The latest figure we have from the sources, effective July 31st, 2025, is R$373,822 per year.
Wow. So even if someone was earning, say, R1,000,000 a year before the accident, the fund's calculation for their lost future earnings is capped at that R$373,822 amount annually.
That's precisely it. It's a fundamental part of how the system manages its finances. It guarantees a level of compensation, but it doesn't promise to replace every single rand a high earner might have lost. It's about sustainability for the fund.
That's a crucial point for people to understand.
It really is. And we see similar cost control with medical expenses. Section 17(4)(b) states that the fund's liability for healthcare costs is generally based on the tariffs used in public health facilities under the National Health Act. Again, it standardizes the cost.
And you mentioned there's a potential change coming related to the National Health Insurance.
Yes. Our sources point to an amendment, Section 58 of Act 20 of 2023, which hasn't started yet. But the plan seems to be to eventually align the RAF's medical liability fully with the reimbursement approach of the upcoming national health insurance system. It's all moving towards greater integration and cost management across the board.
Okay. This all leads to a really significant legal consequence of the whole system, doesn't it? Section 21.
Yes, Section 21. This is huge. It's titled Abolition of Certain Common Law Claims. What it does, essentially, is channel almost all liability towards the fund. Section 21 is blunt. If you're injured or killed due to someone driving a motor vehicle, you generally have no claim under common law against the actual owner or driver of that vehicle or against their employer.
Hold on, let me get this straight. So if I, say, negligently cause an accident and injure someone, the fund pays the compensation. And the person I injured can't sue me directly. I'm protected.
In most cases, yes. That's the fundamental trade-off of the Act. By making the RAF the main, usually the only, source of compensation, it shields individual drivers and owners from potentially ruinous lawsuits. The risk is socialized, spread across everyone who pays the fuel levy.
But surely that protection isn't absolute. What if the driver was drunk or driving recklessly? Does the fund just absorb the cost no matter what?
No, not entirely. That's where the fund's right of recourse comes in, under Section 25. The protection isn't a blank check for bad behavior. In certain, quite specific and generally serious circumstances, the RAF, after it has paid the victim, can actually go back and recover the money it paid out from the negligent owner or driver.
Okay, like what kind of circumstance?
The Act gives clear examples. If the driver was under the influence of alcohol or drugs, and crucially, that intoxication was the sole cause of the accident, the fund can claim back the money. Same if the driver was unlicensed. And importantly, if the owner let an intoxicated or unlicensed person drive their car knowing about it, the fund can recover from the owner too. Or if the owner themselves was driving drunk or unlicensed. So it targets really blameworthy conduct, not just simple negligence.
That clarifies the balance significantly. Okay, let's talk practicalities. For someone who needs to claim, what's the actual process? How do you lodge a claim?
Section 24 sets out the procedure, and you need to follow it carefully. It has to be on the official prescribed claim form, and it needs to be filled out completely, all the particulars. The Act is very strict here. No just putting ticks or dashes, no changes that aren't properly confirmed, and vitally, you need a detailed medical report submitted with the claim form.
Right, dot the I's and cross the T's. And once that form is in, what happens next? Are there deadlines for the RAF?
Yes, procedural timelines are very important. Section 24(5) says the fund has 60 days from when you submit the claim to object to its validity. If they don't object within those 60 days, the claim is legally considered valid. Also, Section 24(6) prevents you from starting a court case issuing summons until 120 days have passed since you lodged the claim. The only exception is if the fund rejects your claim in writing before that 120-day period is up.
Okay, so there's a waiting period. And what about the ultimate deadline? The time limit to even make a claim in the first place?
Prescription, right?
Exactly. Prescription, that's the legal cutoff point. The general rule under Section 23 is that the right to claim prescribes, basically, it expires 3 years after the date the accident happened, but that's if the identity of the negligent driver or owner is known.
3 years, but what happens once you've actually submitted the form?
Good point. Lodging the claim properly, using that Section 24 process, effectively pauses or extends the prescription clock. Once lodged, the claim won't prescribe until 5 years have passed since the accident date. So lodging the form buys you more time, essentially. And are there people exempt from these time limits?
Yes, Section 23(2) is important here. Prescription doesn't run against minors, people under 18. It also doesn't run against someone who is mentally ill or someone who is under curatorship, which means a court has appointed someone to manage their affairs because they can't do it themselves. Time only starts ticking for them once that legal disability ends.
Okay, that's vital protection. Finally, on the practical side, are there situations where the RAF is simply not liable, even if someone was negligent and caused injury? Deal breakers.
Yes, Section 19 lists several exclusions. These are crucial for claimants and lawyers to know. For instance, under Section 19C, the fund generally isn't liable if the claim isn't brought and handled by a qualified attorney or someone representing the state. This aims to ensure claims are properly managed.
Makes sense. What else?
Another key one, Section 19EE, is if the injured person unreasonably refuses or fails to go for a medical examination if the fund reasonably asks them to. The fund has a right to verify the injuries claimed.
And there was one about emotional shock.
That's right, Section 19G. This often causes confusion. The fund is not liable if the only injury suffered is emotional shock from just witnessing or hearing about someone else being injured or killed in the accident. The claim needs to stem from your own bodily injury, not secondary trauma from witnessing. It's a tough line, but it's drawn for sustainability reasons.
Right. Wow. That paints a really detailed picture. It's a system clearly built to provide a safety net, but with very clear boundaries and controls in place. So, wrapping this deep dive up, we set out to get a practical understanding of the RAF Act. And I think what's emerged is this kind of dual nature. On one hand, it absolutely secures compensation for road accident victims, giving them a clear path to claim. But on the other hand, it very deliberately limits that compensation through the serious injury rule, those monetary caps we talked about.
Absolutely. I think the core idea, the genius perhaps, and also the point of debate is shifting that massive financial risk away from individuals who might be uninsured, who could face ruin onto this collective public fund that we all contribute to via the fuel levy. It's almost like a form of social insurance for road use.
Which leads perfectly into a final thought for you, our listeners, to chew on. Think about that tension we discussed. Section 21 takes away your right to sue the driver directly, centralizing the claim with the fund. But then Section 17 puts those hard caps on what the fund will pay, like that $373,822 annual limit. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? When the state steps in to guarantee compensation like this, does the need for financial stability inevitably mean that individual rights, especially for those with the greatest losses, have to be capped? Or is there another way to balance that social guarantee with truly adequate individual compensation? Something worth thinking about.